Well, hey again, Mr. Bleeker here. Welcome back. This lesson today focuses in on the composition of blood. Now, the first thing about blood that you really need to understand is that all of these elements here that you're viewing are floating around in a nutritive medium that we call plasma. And it's a clear fluid. And if you've ever had a cut and basically after it ceases to bleed, sometimes it'll be oozing sort of a fluid, and you'll wonder, well, what is that? Well, that's a sustainable medium, or basically the watery medium that the elements float around in. It has sugar, of course, it has water, there's amino acids in there, salt, all sorts of things. And it's needed just for all this stuff to float around in. It's the easiest way to think about it. Now, if we zoom in here, take a little look here, very little of the blood is actually white blood cells. Their job, of course, is immunity to protect us from the things that get into our blood. Also, patrol for cancer cells, things like that, to recycle um, old cells, basically to be vanguards. That's a very small component of the blood, less than 1%, a tenth of a percent, if you will. Platelets, right here, they're responsible for clotting. So if you cut yourself, platelets are very important. There's a disorder known, genetic disorder known as hemophilia, where these don't have the ability to do what they should do, form a fibrous net and basically make a clot so that you can stem bleeding. So we'll be looking at platelets there. And if we get down to the basically the 44th percentile here, relative figure, we have red blood cells. Now, red blood cells kind of look like donuts. They're interesting, they're sort of squished on both sides, sort of like a jelly donut. But one thing about red blood cells, of course, the primary function is to deliver oxygen throughout the body. A secondary function is that a little bit of carbon dioxide can hitch a ride back on them to the lungs. That's a little bit of carbon dioxide. But the most interesting thing about them is they're covered in their whole cell membrane contains an iron binding compound known as hemoglobin. And adult red blood cells themselves have no nucleus. They have virtually no cellular organelles. Their only job for the better part of a month is to carry oxygen throughout the body. And they're constantly being made, constantly being renewed. They're made in your spongy bone marrow. We should take a look at that right now. So the spongy bone marrow is here. And one of the biggest progenitors of your red blood cells and your white blood cells, etc., would be the leg bones. They have this spongy material is perfect for the production of these following cells. I'm just going to advance this a little bit. Red bone marrow. And there's a few cell lines that you need to know about. Just want to show it right here. There we go. So there's really two lines. The myeloid line will produce your red blood cells known as erythrocytes, and erythro is basically just a prefix that means red. There's a line that sort of it ends up as platelets, but there's this large sort of cell here called the megakaryocyte. This cellular line differentiates until it gets very big, and the megakaryocyte essentially fractures. You could almost think of it as splitting or not quite exploding. That's a little bit dramatic, but it's the formation of these small little platelets that are contained inside sort of this large cell here. Of course, the myeloid line also produces our leukocytes. Leuko is a word which means white, and cyto means cell. Now, there's a series of divisions here, and the reason I fast forwarded over this is I really didn't want, in this point in a course like BC's Biology 12, you don't have to know this material. But what you should know is that this myeloid line, uh, these cells, you could think of these cells up here as being like stem cells, and their job is to turn into all the different sort of blood cells that are needed in our systems, from the erythrocyte to the platelets to the white blood cells, and there's literally an army of white blood cells. Now these are granular, and that's very important. I'm going to zoom in on these. And by granular, you want to think of what it is that they're doing. Are the premier infection fighters, and they have these crazy looking nuclei because these cells are responsible for producing all sorts of materials to combat infection. So you can think of their nucleus as working overtime in producing the enzymes that will help poke holes in invaders like bacteria, E. coli, things like that, to when they envelop viruses to bring them in and kill them with digestive enzymes like you'd find in lysosomes. And just push this a little further. Just a few more things that I wanted to show you. I should mention before I move on too far, there are clear cells here that aren't so granular, known as lymphocytes. Now, the lymphoid line is its own line. It stems off, and these cells are very clear, but with these huge nuclei. They almost look like these sort of sad-looking cat's eyes. And what you're looking at here is a cell that has a massive, massive nucleus because what it does is it produces antibodies. That's largely what the lymphoid line does. And if you haven't heard of antibodies, they're like little chemical markers, little protein markers that mark invaders for infection. You see, the immune system is it can't see the invaders, but it can smell the invaders. And there's no better way to smell the invaders but to make them, well, a little bit more obvious that they're present by coating them in antibodies. So let's just move back to here. This is where I wanted to go. And you get a chance to see sort of how the whole cell line plays out. So you can think of this as sort of the progenitor stem cell. It's sort of the first one that begins. And through various hormonal interactions that we don't have to study in this course, you get the myeloid line and you get the lymphoid line. Now, the myeloid line will produce your platelets, and they call this a megakaryocyte for a reason. This particular cell line becomes very large, and those are all the platelets inside. So once this fractures, these are released into the bloodstream, these tiny little platelets that have such an important job of clotting the blood. There's your erythrocytes there, which are just a hugely important job of oxygenating our bodies. There is a mast cell. Now, if you have very bad allergies, what a mast cell does is it migrates into an area, like say into your nasal epithelium, and when it detects foreign particles, it just explodes and it releases histamines into the area. I think, just one moment. This is a good animation for that. I'm going to just hit replay. So let's say that you get allergens and you're allergic. This could be pollen, it could be dust. Now, really what happens is that flows over your nasal passage is the nasal mucosa here. You have all sorts of white blood cells, and there's some antibody secreting ones, and their job is they'll notice these invaders and they'll be bothered by the presence of them, and they'll produce antibodies. And in response to sort of a large antibody response, the mast cell will start to produce dramatic amounts of histamines, and it produces so many histamines that it releases it into the neighboring tissue. So if this is your nasal area, if you look at the blood vessels down here, now I'll zoom out, what happens is that these histamines land on the cells of your blood vessels, and if I hit replay here, give it a chance to follow it, these cells will move a little further apart, and that's to allow more there's the histamine reception there, and that allows white blood cells to migrate into the area. cells like macrophages to come in here and start to clean up all this goop that you see here that is causing the reaction in the first place. Now, if these histamines here, if these mast cells are quite reactive, in fact, if your body triggers them, then there will be a massive histamine release. You'll get the blood vessels in the nose. You'll get the leaky capillaries, and you'll be running for the Kleenex box. And what you can do, my daughter has a large reaction to cats, for example, and some of you might as well, to various pets. The dander from the cat, for example, is really just, it's their saliva. There's a meat digesting enzyme in their saliva that drives our nasal mucosa crazy, and some of us overreact to it. So when these histamines are released, there's something you can take called an antihistamine, which can block these things so that you don't get these leaky blood vessels down here. If you release antihistamines, you can ensure that the histamine receptor isn't filled. You just want to take these out of circulation. Now, antihistamines, one in particular, Benadryl, it tastes like bubblegum. My daughter doesn't like the flavor, but the antihistamines, like Benadryl, for example, will they'll get the histamines out of the way, but they induce massive sleepiness. But that's a heck of a lot better than, um, massive overreaction to, let's say, cat hair. Okay, so that's the mast cell, and it has a pretty important job releasing these chemicals to call in the immune cells. And it can overreact, but its job is to sort of trigger a response. So if we're looking at the myeloid line here, it's this line that produces our platelets, our red blood cells, our mast cells, and it also, the most important myeloid cells, I mean, they're all important, but what I want to focus in on are these ones down here. And these are the infection fighters. Um, the macrophage, this is interesting. This cell right here does a lot of patrolling. Most of the patrolling here is the monocyte, which patrols your blood. But when the monocytes sneak into a site of infection, they kind of move like an amoeba. And when they move into tissue, when monocytes aren't floating around in the blood anymore, we call them macrophages. Now, this line right here, um, these are the attackers, the engulfers. These are basically, this is hand-to-hand combat when you look at these cell lines here. In the future, you'll study them in more detail, but I just want you to know that these are the fighters. And on the course site, I'll put the full information about these specific cells for you to consume. Now, from the ancestral um, sort of stem cell, we can look at the lymphoid line. And the lymphoid line, when you always see that characteristic very large nucleus, these are some of the clearest cells. So you'll get your B lymphocytes, which mature into plasma cells, and you might have noticed a minute ago these plasma cells activating these mast cells to release histamines. This is the antibody line right here. Their job is to release antibodies to mark invaders, and those invaders, of course, are sort of flagged for destruction. The T lymphocyte line is an antibody producing line that got a bit of an education, actually a lot of an education, in the thymus, which is why we call them the T lymphocytes. So they learn a little bit more about foreign invaders, and they mature in your thymus, of course, which is just down a little bit posterior from your thyroid gland. Now, there's two types of T lymphocytes there to study. Um, there's helper T cells, and it's really right around here that HIV, the virus that causes the disease AIDS, if this can be turned off, this is a major off switch for the immune system right here. Um, if the T lymphocytes are turned off, they tend to alert the immune system that a large invasion is going on. Um, T helper cells, in particular, also known as CD4 cells. So this is a very important cell in alerting the immune system to fight infection. Because if this cell is turned off, you can't really expect the B cells to be casting antibodies at anything. So you can think of these as the scouts of the immune system. There is a very important lymphoid cell that kills cancer cells in your bodies each and every day. It's known as the cytotoxic killer cell or the natural killer cell. And it's interesting because this line tends to be very clear non-granular cytoplasm. But if you had to pick one cell that can patrol the body and it can control the tissues and it can really make decisions about engaging in warfare, it's quite free to attack. It's the natural T killer cell or the cytotoxic T, and it does exactly what it says. Wipes out cancer cells, and it's basically it's basically the go-to cell in the immune system. Now, on the course side, I've also placed this. If you want to get an idea of how the different cells work, the lymphocytes, and a little bit more information, I make these available. The monocytes, the ones we've already looked at, our frontline killers here, our neutrophils and our eosinophils and things like that. So I'll also make this one available for a little bit more information. But really, I just want you to know the basic cells of the immune system and in general what they do. And I think, there we go. Sort of leads us back here. So I'm really not going to take up much more time. The most important things I want you to know are blood composition, what is plasma, right? What are white blood cells? What are platelets? What's their job? And what are those red blood cells? Well, the reason blood looks red in the first place is because of these guys right here. And it's the iron compound. You might have clued in by now that iron in the presence of oxygen rusts and it gets this sort of reddish, uh, becomes reddish in appearance. And that's the whole function of hemoglobin. Before we leave, we should look at the hemoglobin molecule, which is present in here we go, is present in the membrane of the red blood cells. And there's something quite important that needs to be demonstrated here. And I think this will do. There we go. The hemoglobin molecule is a quaternary protein. It's a very complex protein. And it's capable of binding each hemoglobin molecule. And there's many, many molecules, of course, on the membrane of red blood cells. Now, each hemoglobin molecule is capable of binding to, each unit of hemoglobin, I should say, is capable of binding to oxygen. Now, because oxygen floats around as O2, there are two oxygens here, two, and two. So each hemoglobin unit is capable of carting around 8 oxygen molecules, and that's fairly effective. And we've evolved an iron-based oxygen transport. Now, there are other forms of oxygen transport. Oxygen has an affinity for things like copper, but we don't have copper-based blood, right? We're not Vulcans in Star Trek, for example, where humans have an iron-based blood, and it's quite effective at what it does. So that's it, folks. Have a good one, and we'll see you again next time.